What makes a compelling villain? While no writer's checklist is probably exactly the same, I'd be willing to bet sympathetic backstory and reasonable motivations are on each of them. But what happens when the villain doesn't meet these standards? In the case of Castlevania, you get Isaac, a compelling and unique villain with a backstory that doesn't explain his actions at all and has no reasonable motivations for his goal of ending the entire human race. Did I say compelling and unique? Oh, yeah, I did. Just a reminder, I am an author, and if you want to check out my books, they're listed in the description below. There are certain standards modern villains generally need to meet for an audience to deem them a compelling villain, but it mostly boils down to justifiable reasoning. This doesn't excuse their behavior, but it explains it. Justifiable reasoning typically takes one of two forms. One, they are traumatized enough by their backstory that the audience sympathizes/empathizes with them and understands why they're the way they are, i.e. Jinx from Arcane, who we see go from innocent child to a literal terrorist. Or number two, their end goal is morally good or logical to explain their morally incorrect means, i.e. Walter White for most of Breaking Bad. These standards are the bare minimum expectations when it comes to writing villains. Audiences expect a villain that they can root for or feel sorry for, so those are the villains writers tend to write. Isaac doesn't have either standard. He used to be a slave, mistreated by the world, and beaten by his master even though he was just trying to serve his master well. This is obviously a tragic backstory. However, that's about the extent of it. We see a couple flashbacks, but honestly, what we see and know of his backstory, it doesn't feel like it justifies his goal of exterminating the human race. Then again, I think writers would be hard-pressed to find ways to traumatize their characters for them to set that smart goal. Isaac's backstory explains his personality, but definitely not his goals or actions. There is no backstory that can justify wanting to kill all of humanity. And to the second standard, the ends don't justify Isaac's means because mass genocide is bad, so omnicide. By today's standards, Isaac shouldn't work as the villain, at least not as well as he does. I'll admit, I wasn't totally on board with his character throughout some of the show. His goal of ending the entire human race because he was a slave seemed a bit extreme. His theory that raising people from the dead by turning them into monsters was somehow fulfilling God's wish was kind of weird. Altogether, his character, while interesting, seemed a bit unbelievable. Like when he was journeying through the Middle East with an army of demonic monsters, he expected people to simply welcome him and took their animosity for a human flaw. I don't know about you, but if I saw a man leading an army of demons, I wouldn't want him in my town either. I came to realize these obviously flawed reactions were the result of his own bias towards humanity. He thinks they're all bad, so that's all he can see. Even when people are kind to him, he sees that as an individual kindness rather than a fundamental part of humanity. This bias is obviously spawned by the trauma in his backstory. However, this bias, much like his goals and actions, doesn't constantly reference his backstory. I think it was in season 3 that I started to realize that Isaac's villainous arc was based in the present, not in the past. Yes, his backstory influenced him to become a villain, but Isaac does not dwell on his backstory. Isaac lives in the present. His villainy is based in the present. He isn't doing what he's doing because he's traumatized. He wants to do what he's doing. He wants to eradicate the entire human race. It isn't out of fear he'll be abused again. It isn't because humans remind him of his trauma. He thinks humans are a blight on the earth and wants them gone. I mean, fair. Even his self-flagellation, while a reminder of what he went through, isn't presented as him reliving his trauma, rather him strengthening himself. And that made me think about another great villain, Heath Ledger's Joker. He has no known backstory, and yet he's a great villain. His past may have made him a psychopath, but he doesn't use that as an excuse, nor does the movie make trauma a part of his present story. His villainy is based off of present wants and goals, not past traumas, just like Isaac. Personalities are influenced by the backstory, but actions don't have to be. This basically goes directly against some modern standards for villains. You You can make an interesting villain without having a backstory that explains their behavior or directly influences it. Not every villain must be acting out of trauma, and you can make an interesting villain without having a good end to justify their villainous means. Not every villain needs their actions justified. And just a reminder, when I say justified, I mean reasonable, not morally correct. Isaac is certainly not your standard modern villain, but there was a time when modern villains were the anomaly. A villain you felt something for was rarer 20 years ago, and many iconic villains were written without having a backstory that directly influences their present actions. They weren't necessarily evil for the sake of evil, but they weren't evil for the sake of trauma. These days, it feels like every villain is tragic, every villain is plagued by their past, and every decision the villain makes centers around their trauma. Their past defines their present, which isn't unrealistic, but it can get boring when every villain is like that. When everyone is traumatized, no one is. In an age of entertainment, when every villain wants you to cry for them, a villain that asks for nothing but your attention is a very nice change. I talk a lot about connection between audience and characters on this channel, how important it is for audiences to connect emotionally with characters, because that's typically how they get invested in them. And that's basically the whole point of stories, at least in my opinion. And there are few things better than writing a villain who your audience loves and cries for, something that might be even more satisfying than your audience loving the protagonist. But maybe the goal for writers doesn't have to be to make the audience sympathize with the villain. Maybe it's enough for the audience to be interested in the villain, to be intrigued, to want to see how their diabolical plan unfolds and how they change. Maybe that is a connection in of itself, an intellectual connection. Isaac's personality, his philosophy, and his morals are enough to make me interested in him. Now, does that mean I care about him, like emotionally? Well, not really, at least not while he was still actively a villain, but at the end when he was kind of a good guy, I did care. I did find myself caring. I mean, I'm not emotionally invested in the Joker or Gus either. It's just not the type of villain they are. But I think that's okay, and I think you can make an equally compelling villain, even if you don't cry for them. So what makes a compelling villain? A lot of different things, but certainly not checking off everything on the checklist every time you write one. I mean, I can only read about a villain with daddy issues so many times. There are different types of characters, different types of connections, and they don't all require meeting the standards of modern villains or characters in general. There are characters I get so emotionally connected to, I might just shed a tear if something horrible happens to them. Flip, I still think about Xenoblade. Oh my word, Xenoblade 3. I'm sorry I keep going on about this, but if you haven't played the game or watched the cutscenes, you have to, because Xenoblade 3 tore me apart. They didn't have to do that at the end. They really didn't. Sorry. And then there are other characters who I just love watching burn the world down. Isaac doesn't end up setting the world ablaze, but the journey to him putting down the match was very interesting indeed. I'm done ranting now. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you take my opinion as anything but gospel, and I hope you check out my books in the description below. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.